announcement. Everyone's disappeared off camera other than Daniel. But we have just two passages I thought about looking at this evening. One of which is the very, very end of the Zohar's commentary on the upcoming week's parasha, Hayyé Sarah, and the other comes from the following week in Parashat Toldot. I think. Let's see if we can get through both actually, because they're quite different and they're both quite short. I wonder if anyone's keen to read. I'm going to share my screen. We've got the PDF version tonight, not the EPUB version. So it's a very white screen. Apologies if you're in a dark room. It's about to get very bright. And I'm just going to make that bigger so you can hopefully see a bit better. And this first bit here, Rabbi Chizkiah opened, is comes at the very, very end, kind of an add-on. It doesn't seem to be about the parasha Hayyé Sarah, but instead kind of seems to be somewhat of a standalone and acts as a bit of an epilogue to the Zohar's commentary on the parasha. And it represents a very common view in the Zohar, and one that's actually quite influential in a lot of other thought as well, regarding exile and sovereignty, and what we might call a kind of religious Zionism, which I thought might be interesting considering the circumstances. So anyone fancy reading?
I'll start if you like. There's not too many complicated words.
No, there's a couple funny ones, but don't worry, we can't see you, Janice. I don't know if that's on purpose.
There's a reason for that, because my front teeth have all dropped out because I had a temporary plate, and it's not a pretty sight. So
no. That's okay.
The children said I looked like someone from Halloween.
Oh, well, that's very mean of them. No, that's absolutely fine. I hope you're able to get it fixed in a way that.
Yeah, there's a temporary fix tomorrow. So, and the week, hopefully I'll get them fixed. It's a long story anyway.
Okay, that's all right. Nice to hear your voice.
No. It says, right. So, who gave up Jacob for spoil? Come and see. Ever since the day the temple was destroyed, blessings are absent from the world, withheld, as if they were above and below. So all those other lower rungs are empowered and come to dominate Israel. Who will bring this about? Through their sins. Words of this verse were unsettled, for it is written, give up Jacob for spoil. Having said this, against whom we have sinned, the verse should be read again, against whom they have sinned. And if we have sinned, the verse should have continued, we would not. Why they would not have just said, we have sinned.
Okay, I'm going to pause you there, because obviously they're trying to parse out this verse. So it's probably going to help us if we take a look at the verse. I'm just going to pull it up so that we can see it in depth. But what kind of is the question that's being asked so far? Not just about the verse from Isaiah. But what is the general sentiment here? What are we talking about?
I don't know how reading into it. It's like the safety of Israel, because we've been sinned. Is it going to be taken away, or am I jumping to conclusion?
Yeah, you're on the right track. They're looking back, really, right? Looking back at the destruction of the temple, and this key statement here: ever since the day the temple was destroyed, blessings have been absent from the world. And they specify the world above and the world below, right? So there's something cosmically that went wrong when the temple was destroyed. Not just that Israel as a people lost its home, but also that kind of the world was corrupted in some sense. And their jumping off point is this verse from Isaiah. So I'm just going to jump over here to this verse, because actually we kind of have to look at it to understand what they're saying. Where is it? Here we go. So this is the verse. It comes from the end of chapter 42 of Isaiah. And actually, they're talking about both verses, 24 and 25. And this comes at the end of one of Isaiah's prophecies. He's trying to get the people to listen, right? You hear this language, listen up. Here's the truth. Mi natan, and there's two versions of how to read this. Lim shisa Yaakov Yisrael levozizim halo Adonai zu chatanulo. Velo avu bidrachav haloch, velo shamu betorato. Who was it that gave Jacob over to spoil and Israel to plunderers? Surely God, against whom they sinned, in whose ways they would not walk, and whose teaching they would not obey. Okay, so there's a confusing thing here about the word in English, they sinned, because actually it seems to say we sinned, or there's some confusion about it. The Hebrew is chatanu, we sinned, right? Against God whom we sinned is actually what it says, but it's often translated as they, probably because we're not too comfortable with the idea that we're calling ourselves responsible. The next verse, which they reference, Vayishpoch alav chema apo ve'azuz milchama ve'talhatehu misaviv ve'lo yada ve'tiv arbo ve'lo yasim alev, who poured out wrath, anger, and the fury of war upon them. It blazed upon them all about, but they heeded not. It burned among them, but they gave it no thought. So Isaiah, just to provide context, Isaiah here is talking about the Babylonian conquest and the destruction of the first temple. The Zohar is talking about the Roman conquest and destruction of the second temple, which are about 700 years apart in history. But the question is the same, right? Which Isaiah is saying, who is it that turned Jacob over for spoil? The answer is, it was God, because they sinned against God, because they didn't do what they were supposed to. They didn't obey the teaching. Right? It's a pretty straightforward, if very troubling theology that suggests that the reason that the temple was destroyed is because the Israelites botched it. Now let's take a look back at the Zohar once again and have a look to see
And what specifically do you think this phrase "give Jacob over to despoilment"? What does that refer to?
It refers to the Jacob here as a stand-in for Israel as a nation, and it refers to the Babylonian exile by Isaiah. Right? Who is it that handed Israel over? Who's responsible for the destruction of the elites and the society that happened in 586 BCE? Isaiah's answer is, it's us, guys. It's our fault. So the Zohar is pointing out exactly what we've seen in the commentary. That is, it says we sinned, but we tend to understand it as they sinned, and do we take responsibility for it? Blah, 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 blah. Who's responsible? The Zohar is revising this question and actually giving a new answer to Isaiah's question, kind of ignoring what Isaiah says himself and instead trying to answer the question on its own merits. And they have a very different conception of what exactly happened that day when the temple was destroyed, 9th of Av, year 70 in our calendar. They have a very different conception of what happened. But the key thing is it told us that when it was destroyed, blessing disappeared from the world, right? Something cosmically was disrupted.
That's very sad, because it sort of, if you think what's going on now in the world and you think, is it a parallel? It's a bit frightening.
Well, please God, hopefully we're not going to find ourselves exiled a third time from the land of Israel. But I think many people have that fear. And there's a real sense of danger, I suppose. Okay, so they pick up the same thread, but actually, Janice, do you want to keep reading? You're on a roll.
Okay, but actually, when the sanctuary was destroyed, the temple burned and the people exiled. I'm not sure that sought to be uprooted from her sight to accompany them in exile. She said, "First I will go see my house, my temple, and visit the site I used to inhabit, and the stations of the priests and Levites who served in my house." Is that the God in the female sense?
That's right, spot on. So the Shekhinah is the kind of, let's say, goddess, because that's really what's going on here. Is we're talking about God as a two-part entity, God and goddess. And what the Zohar envisions when we say God is actually that there is both a male and female aspect. Interestingly, it suggests to us that when the temple was destroyed, it was Shekhinah, right, the feminine aspect, who kind of volunteered to go with them, with the people, right? Because her dwelling was the temple. So she decided to accompany them in exile. She went on kind of a tour of the destruction. First, I'll go see my house, my temple, and visit the site I used to be in. And then she's going to go with them, with the people of Israel, into exile. So there's a notion in the Zohar, which in Aramaic is Shekhinah begaluta, right? That actually the Shekhinah, the feminine aspect of God, it goes into exile with the people of Israel. Just to point out in the following paragraph we're about to read here from Rabbi Elazar, this phrase, assembly of Israel, is another name for Shekhinah, right? In Hebrew, Knesset Yisrael, it's another one of the many names that's used for that feminine entity. Like all divinities in Judaism, we have lots of names we use interchangeably, which can make it very confusing. So Rabbi Elazar is expanding on this idea that the Shekhinah volunteered to go into exile. Carry on.
Rabbi Elazar said, at the moment, the Assembly of Israel looked up and saw that her husband had withdrawn from her, far, far above. She descended below and entered her house, gazing at all those places. A voice was heard far, far above. A voice was heard below, as it is written. A voice is heard on a height, wailing, bitter, bitter weeping. Rachel weeping for her children, Jeremiah, as has been established.
Okay, so if you...
It's the saying that that God's married to themselves, basically.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Right, God is actually, in the Zohar's conception, kind of personified by two different personalities, characteristics. One of which is a male, distant father figure, and the other of which is a intimate, and caring, and violent mother figure. The conception of it is fascinating, and also, like, Freud, eat your heart out, right? This idea of how we conceive of God as basically a pair of parents. It's really interesting. It also has lots of implications for other aspects of how we understand sexuality, gender, etc. But the proof of this idea that the Shekhinah was separated, that there's a estrangement that occurs between the masculine, which withdraws away, right? He goes off in, somewhere else into his study, but she is down there in the thick of it, seeing what's going on, feeling the emotion and the pathos and the pain of the Israelites, and crying out. The proof of this is this famous line from Jeremiah, where he talks about Rachel, personified here as a symbol more than actual literal Rachel, weeping for her children, wailing, her voice being heard. This is counted as a description of the Shekhinah. We looked a little bit at all these sources about Rachel a week and a half ago when her yahrzeit came past, and it's a very rich tradition of seeing Rachel as being more or less a symbol of the Shekhinah. Okay, so we have this really robust image of a mother who cares, a father who doesn't, and the mother, the Shekhinah, is interested to join the people, to feel their pain, not to run away from it. Okay. Does someone else want to pick up from here? About halfway through here? When she went into exile?
I'll go.
Thank you, Janice, for reading before. Take it away, Lee.
When she went into exile, she gazed at her people and saw them being oppressed, trampled under the feet of other nations. Then she said, "Who gave up Jacob for spoil?" They replied, "Was it not Adonai against whom we have sinned?" She responded, "In whose ways they would not walk and whose Torah they would not obey."
Okay, how is the Isaiah quote now put into her mouth, so to speak?
Which is basically saying they didn't behave themselves.
Yeah, in a very maternal way, she's kind of teaching them a lesson. She sees all the misery that the Israelites are enduring in exile, right? She sees them being oppressed and trampled under the feet of other nations. And she says, okay, well, how did this happen, right? The Isaiah quote, "Who gave up Jacob for spoil?" And they said, "Isn't it God who against whom we sinned?" And she kind of finishes the quote. It's really interesting. She doesn't really respond. She just finishes the quote, "In whose ways they would not walk and whose Torah they would not obey." Right? So she is there to kind of help them and guide them and hopefully bring them back, but is there literally down in the thick of it, in exile, in misery, suffering along with the people of Israel. And meanwhile, the male, who's also identified as the Blessed Holy One, that's the language here, is absent, right? Is gone, is missing, is away from the scene. Lots to say about where Freud got his ideas from, by the way. Okay, carry on, Lee.
When one day the Blessed Holy One attends to his people, an assembly of Israel returns from exile, she will be first to go to her house, since the holy temple will be built first. The Blessed Holy One will say to her, "Rise from the dust." She will respond, "Where should I go? My house is destroyed, my temple burned." So first, the Blessed Holy One will build the sanctuary, restore the temple, rebuild the city fittingly. Then he will raise her from the dust, as is written, Adonai builds Jerusalem first, then he gathers the banished of Israel. He will tell her, shake off your dust, arise, sit enthroned, O Jerusalem. Then he heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds, revival of the dead. And it is written, I will put my spirit within you.
Okay, so we have this whole kind of symbolic representation of exile, and now a symbolic description of what happens when exile ends, Geula, redemption. What does it look like with these characters in play, the masculine, the feminine, the Israelites, the temple?
Sorry, go on.
It's like nurturing parents, trying to pull them together and re-educate them and bring them back.
Yeah, and in the future, right? This image of what happens in the future, it's really about the relationship between the two of them, right? Between the Holy Blessed One, that's the male father figure, and Assembly of Israel, that's the female figure, Shekhinah. It's about their relationship being repaired to some extent as well. What about all this dialogue, right? He tells her, rise up from the dust, shake off the dust and arise. What's the order of events? In order for them to be reunited, what has to happen?
He has to come back to him.
She has to come back to him. Daniel, what were you going to say?
I've lost my place now.
All right.
She rises from the dust and asks where to go, so then the sanctuary is rebuilt. Then he will raise her from the dust. Then he will regather everybody back to Israel. And then again, we'll tell her, or is her relating to Knesset Israel as well? Shake off your dust, arise, sit enthroned, then heals the brokenhearted, binds up their wounds, and revives the dead, and then puts his spirit within us.
Yeah. So this kind of vision of the end of days, we might call it, or some kind of future messianic redemption, involves a combination of the feminine Shekhinah being awakened, almost like that presence, that symbol being activated, and then as a result, God responding to actually rectify the damage, to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the city, and for them to be reunited once more, which is of course the goal. Basically, from the Zohar's point of view, all of history from the Jewish experience at least can be understood as an elaborate version of the Parent Trap. Right? We're just really desperately trying to get the Holy Blessed One and his Shekhinah back together again, which involves us returning to the land of Israel, rebuilding the city of Jerusalem, restoring sovereignty, and critically, considering the question that was being asked, right, walking in the ways of God and obeying the laws of the Torah.
There's this distinctive sense of the masculine form of God having to do reconstruction and rebuilding work first, and that the Shekhinah, it seems like it's represents the emotional connection with God that has nowhere to go. It's there and present and with the exiled people, but without a temple or without Jerusalem, it's kind of what's the word I want? Kind of lacking direction or something.
Yeah, it's incomplete, right? There's a real sense of in Hebrew they use a lot of language around something being missing, chaser, or diminished, right? We're really pleased to have the Shekhinah on our side, but until she's restored to her place, right, and until she gets her house back, there's something that's always going to be half-hearted about it. It's a very interesting conception of Jewish history, right? And I think there's a real question about how the current events, i.e. the modern state of Israel, fits into this narrative as well, right? Which different people inspired by these ideas would answer in different ways. But it's interesting to think about the order of events. What does it mean to return? What does it mean to kind of try to go back to some distant glorified past That's what all the language of Mashiach is about, right? It's about a rightful king returning to rule over Israel on the throne, restoration of the monarchy, restoration of the temple. There's a real sense that for this source, at least, the end goal is the restoration of things as they were. But actually, how exactly that happens is not always clear. And whether people think about it this way is also not obvious. There were lots of people, and still are lots of people, who are very influenced by this way of thinking. This way of thinking has been so normative in some Jewish communities that many Sidurim begin every single mitzvah, with the words L'shem Yichud Kudsha Brichu Ushechinte, right? For the sake of the unification of the Holy Blessed One and his Shekhinah. That's why we do things. So this idea became extremely influential to many, many communities, and is still in many ways in the background of lots of the thinking that goes on around modern Israel. Okay. Any final thoughts on that before we move on to our second source?
Yeah.
Okay. Now for something different, we're going to jump down into Toldot. And where is it? A little bit further down. And we're going to have a look at a question about the righteous and them being tested. This is particularly pertinent because we just read the Akedah, right, this past Shabbat, a couple of days ago, where it describes God as testing Abraham. And there's lots of other tests to come, including tests of Joseph in Genesis and Jacob in Genesis, and to some degree Isaac as well. And this idea of kind of why the righteous might be tested, what the purpose of that is what the Zohar is trying to explore to some degree. So it kind of gives us this history of it and tries to justify the way in which God seems to penalize or test those who are particularly identified as righteous. Lee, do you want to continue?
Sure.
Okay.
Rabbi Yehuda opened, Adonai tests the righteous, but the wicked and one who loves violence his soul hates. How perfectly arranged are the deeds of the Blessed Holy One. Whatever he does is based entirely on justice and truth, as is written, the rock, his work is perfect. Come and see, the Blessed Holy One did not judge Adam until he had commanded him for his own good, so that his heart and will would not stray on an alien path, so that he would not be defiled. But he wasn't careful and violated his master's command, after which he imposed punishment upon him. Nevertheless, he did not punish him as he deserved, postponing his anger, so he endured for a day, which is 1,000 years, except for those 70 he gave to King David, who had none at all of his own.
Okay. Leaving aside the last thing about the math related to Adam and King David, what are we talking about here? What's the opening? What's the framing? Why is this verse from Psalms being used to start us off?
Well, it's almost saying that God knows what he's doing, but then the other day we said God was arguing with himself. So it's like a contradictory to what we were discussing last week.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly, when we looked at the text of the Torah, it looks like God is kind of, of two minds. And here we have this idea that all of God's actions are absolutely perfect and unquestionable. And, these things can coexist in any religion. You never have to have intellectual consistency. There's a huge degree of diversity. But let's try and take the Zohar at its own face value. It's trying to justify that God's deeds are perfect, no mistakes. And when Psalm says God tests the righteous, but the wicked and the one who loves violence, God hates, you have this dichotomy, right? So for the righteous, God tests them, and for the wicked, God hates them. Those aren't opposites. What would the opposite be? If God hates the wicked, what would you expect God would do with the righteous?
He'd love the righteous.
He'd love the righteous, right? That's the natural binary love and hate. Instead of saying God loves the righteous, it says God tests the righteous.
Right, he's trying to, if you think of somebody, you're trying to give them a challenge and get to make them be stronger.
Very good. Okay. So that love, maybe, if we can call it, is expressed through sometimes some pretty harsh testing, like Adam, like Abraham. What's this thing about trying to justify Adam's punishment and saying that actually Adam wasn't punished as bad as he should be?
Because he let Adam live when he told him not to.
Okay, good, right? So it would seem from the text of Genesis chapter 1, when it says, if you eat of that fruit, you will die, that the punishment would be that Adam would die. But actually, he doesn't. He lives for, according to the text, depending on how you count it, about 930 years. So the Zohar, you're saying, oh, yes, he lived for a whole day. A day in God years is 1,000 years. This is a common thing where a God day equals like dog years. A God day equals 1,000 human years. So Adam lived 1,000 years, but actually voluntarily, this is a midrash that they're referencing, Adam voluntarily gave up 70 of those years to David, who had kind of forfeited his own life, and as a result had kind of borrowed time from Adam. Fascinating idea, right? That you can kind of trade off years and say, oh, you have these 70, I'll keep these 930.
Why did David have none of his own? I just noticed I can do this. Can you see that?
Yeah, lovely. Lovely. Oh, it moves with the screen though.
I'll get rid of it.
Oh, that's all right. So the reference here, let's just zoom over the footnote, is according to a Midrashic tradition, King David was destined to die at childbirth, but Adam offered him 70 of his own 1,000 allotted years. So David lived for 70 years and Adam for 930. Okay, so there's just this midrash that actually David was never supposed to live at all. He was supposed to die. But Adam in the Garden of Eden saw how important it was for David to live, and so lent him 70 years. Kind of a bonkers idea, but let's just take it at face value.
How does this as you say, strange maths, how does this tie into the notion of days we were talking about last time?
Well, it might link up with this idea of days, although basically what it's talking about here is there's a quote from Psalms that says 1,000 years are like a day in your eyes. And that leads all mystical traditions, not just the Zohar, to interpret this idea that for God, time works differently. And God time, one single day of God time, is 1,000 years to human beings. So you could understand that if the last text we looked at before, which is what you're referencing, if that was talking about God days, then actually it's 1,000-year period, like each millennium reports on itself. If it was talking about human days, then it's a human day. But there are lots of places where they use this funny math to try and talk about creation, for instance, where they talk about, the days of creation are God days, so they actually last for thousands of years and whatever else. And there's lots of ways in which they kind of use this math in order to play with the ideas of time and how time passes for God versus for us. I think the best analogy is when we talk about dog years, right? That for every 7 years of our life is 1 year for a dog, which is, a convenient way to explain the difference in lifespan and the equivalent percentage of life that a dog experiences during a set period of time. Okay. Yeah. So there's a sense that God is very just, but actually part of that justice is not punishing people not punishing people fully, which doesn't seem very comforting at the moment, but maybe it will be. Let's see. Lee, do you want, sorry, Janice.
It's trying to be a lenient parent and getting back to this nurturing bit.
Yeah. It's not always fair to never punish at all, but you never want to be the parent who punishes fully. You want to kind of always make sure that there's leniency, restraint.
And then the kids push you further, which is probably what's going to happen next.
Maybe. It's a hard job, right? Imagine being a parent for all creation. It's a rough gig. Okay. Someone else want to read? Daniel, do you want to read? Lee, you've been doing great, but trying to jump around.
So, similarly, he does not punish a person in accordance with the evil deeds he constantly commits. For if so, the world could not endure. Rather, the Blessed Holy One postpones his anger for the righteous, and for the wicked, even more than the righteous. For the wicked, so that they will turn back completely and endure in this world and in the world that is coming. As it is written, as I live, declares Adonai Elohim, I do not desire the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn from his way, vehaya, and live. and live in this world and live in the world that is coming. This is why he always postpones his anger for them, so that a fine shoot will issue from them into the world. As he generated Abraham from Terah, a fine shoot, stock and root, a fine share for the world.
Okay. How does God deal with punishing the wicked? What's God's objective? What's the procedure? How does it work?
He's trying to educate them to get them to turn. And there's lots of things about someone who's been wicked and has returned to God is better than someone who hasn't made a conscious effort.
Very good, right? There's a famous statement: the person who has sinned and done tshuva is better than the person who never sinned at all. Right? And there's a sense here that God's goal is to try and hold off the punishment. The punishment is constantly delayed. It's like a suspended sentence, right? It's always being pushed off and pushed off and pushed off. The hope being that the wicked will actually turn back and change their ways so that they will be able to live and not die, right? There's a connection with death and wickedness. And they've got a great proof text here, right? I don't want the death of the wicked, but instead that the wicked turn back from their way and live. Right? So God wants them to live. That's the sentiment here. And so anger is postponed. And there's this lovely idea, that last idea, that actually part of the goal is sometimes that the wicked person, if the anger is postponed long enough, the wicked person might actually engender a good person, right? That often from a bad shoot will come a good person. So Terach is Abraham's father, who was wicked according to the tradition, but Abraham is good, right? And you see this many times, that actually what we kind of want is that even if someone can't change their ways, maybe their children can make up for it and do tshuva on their behalf and come back and be better. Really interesting idea in some way of how God relates to the wicked. What does this mean for the wicked person during their life? Do they experience the punishment they deserve?
No, they don't.
Nope. They do not, because God is being compassionate and God is hoping they'll change their ways. The wicked people are the least likely to actually experience the punishment they deserve in during their lifetime.
If they're not punished, how do they know they've got to behave themselves?
Great question. Great question. Let's park that one for a minute and see instead what God does with the righteous. So if with the wicked, God holds off all punishment and hoping that they'll change their mind, and actually they don't experience much punishment during their life, what about the righteous? Daniel?
However, the Blessed Holy One always deals strictly with the righteous in all that they do, because he knows that they will not stray right or left. So he tests them, not for his own sake, since he knows their impulse and the strength of their faith, but rather for their sake, to elevate them, as he did with Abraham, for it is written, God, Nisa, tested Abraham. What does Nisa mean? As is said, raise Nes a banner. Lift up Nes a banner. He raised his banner throughout the world, although this has already been explained, for the Blessed Holy One raised Abraham's banner in the eyes of all, as is written, Nisa. He elevated Abraham. Similarly, to raise the banner of the righteous, the Blessed Holy One tests them, elevating them throughout the world.
Okay. Lots of interesting things here, including a great bit of grammar with this root Nisa. But what's the difference with how God deals with the righteous?
He's tough on them.
Yeah. For whose sake? Why? What's the point of God being tough on the righteous and lenient on the wicked?
To elevate them further.
Yeah, they can handle it, right? There's a little bit of this kind of common Christian idea that, oh, God doesn't give you something you can't handle, although I think that's quite problematic. But there's a real sense here that actually sometimes it is the righteous who have the hardest tests and trials, because through those trials, they can further be elevated. And in particular, what they can be is a nace. Nace is a fabulous word in Hebrew, because it's literally a banner in a military sense, i.e. the bannermen who carried the flags into military battle, whose job was to show, this is who we're fighting for, this is our symbol, this is who we work for. It's also the word we use for miracle, right? When we say miracle, for instance, when we talk about Hanukkah, Nes Gadol Hayyé Sarah, a great miracle happened there on the dreidel. Actually, the word nes that we translate as miracle is a Christian term. What it is a banner, right? It's a flag. It's something that you plant and you say, look, someone did something here, or someone is represented by this symbol here. Just like planting your flag on the moon is a way to say, I'm here. God performing miracles is a way to say, yep, I'm in the world. This is my flag and my banner. So the righteous actually, through their tests and trials, through being Nisa, tested, become Nes, kind of bannermen, banner women for God in the world. They hold the standard because they're able to be held to a higher standard.
You can kind of see as well, it's that question, isn't it? Why do good people suffer and the wicked seem to live in luxury and wealth? Or, you know, zooming out a little bit, you could kind of see they're trying to answer that, I suppose.
Absolutely, right? Absolutely. That's the question that bothers most people, especially religious people, is like, well, if being righteous is a good thing and God looks after the righteous, then why are all the righteous people suffering and all these other people who do rubbish are profiting, right? Why are all the criminals enjoying their life very much and all of us are struggling? And, you know, it provides an answer. I'm not saying it's a satisfying answer, by the way, but it is if you identify yourself as one of the righteous who are being tested and thus can become a banner for God. It's an empowering answer because it means that there's some meaning in that suffering, that it can provide a elevation, a challenge, that suffering itself can be something which can be used to help you grow. It's a problematic thing to tell someone who's currently in suffering, right? Oh, it's for your own good. It'll help you grow. I wouldn't ever counsel anyone to say that. But sometimes ex post facto, after the fact, we can look back on our own suffering and those difficult moments of our lives and go, actually, I grew from that. That helped me grow, be better. It tested me, it tried me, and I came out of it stronger. But it's hard to think that way when you're currently experiencing it. Okay, let's carry on a bit further. They're going to further explore this idea of God testing the righteous. Daniel, you're on a roll. Do you want to keep going?
Come and see when...
Oh, you jumped. Hang on.
No, jumped one. He tests the righteous. Why? Rabbi Shimon said, because when the Blessed Holy One delights in the righteous, what is written? Adonai delights in crushing him by disease. This has been established, but the reason is that the delight of the Blessed Holy One focuses only on soul, not on body. For soul resembles soul, while body is incapable of uniting above, even though the body's image abides in supernal mystery. Come and see when the Blessed Holy One delights in a person's soul, deriving pleasure from her, he strikes the body so that the soul can dominate. For as long as soul corresponds with body, soul cannot prevail, but once the body is broken, soul becomes dominant. Okay,
so we now get a very, I think, troubling, challenging application of this idea. And there's a certain justification for it and the dichotomy of soul and body. What's going on here?
It's almost like the body is caused to suffer, so as the soul can ascend away from the body.
Right. Sorry, John.
Body is capable of uniting above, uniting with God, even though the body's image abides. So you would be sort of the soul that kind of looks like the body, but it's not the body. It's separate the two.
Yeah. And suffering is often used as a way to elevate the soul at the cost of the body, seems to be the implication. And it's justified by this verse from Isaiah, which Rabbi Shimon brings in very harshly, right? That God delights in crushing him by disease. Out of context, by the way. But again, kind of a troubling thing to suggest, especially when someone is suffering, but an interesting way of conceiving of why good people, sometimes especially in a very physical way, suffer. Janice, what were you going to say? I saw your green rectangle emerge.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, God's so concerned about the soul, and also what I've just been through is, it's sort of, you know, the body is just a function. It's not, our essence is who we are inside that counts. Does that make sense?
That's
right.
right.
Makes me think a little, the part about disease, it kind of makes me think of, there was the comparison last week with the children of the East, and sort of Vedic traditions, and it makes me think of asceticism and like starving oneself or depriving oneself to try and achieve like a higher spirituality. It's got a very, very similar tone there.
Yeah, right. That actually, by harming, in that case, it's self-inflicted, but by harming the body, one can elevate the soul. Here you have a similar suggestion, but that actually God is doing this to some extent with an agenda only for the righteous, to help them, to give them trials, to give them tests, to give them opportunities to be this banner for other people, to demonstrate their righteousness through suffering. I think it's incredibly, again, troubling, difficult, problematic idea, but it is quite a prominent idea in a lot of these sources, and one that a lot of people will subscribe to, and even some find comforting. Right? I can see how it could be comforting for some, can see how it could be horrifying for others, and that's true of most theology.
It's almost like God's gathering these good souls together.
Yeah, it comes from a desire, right? That language is used a lot. That God kind of wants the righteous souls to come back, almost wants them to be closer, and that means drawing them away from the material world in some way, whether that's through trials and tribulations or through disease or through whatever. There's a kind of a desire to be close to the righteous souls, which actually harms them. Whereas the wicked, God is kind of not that interested in. And so actually they live a safer, happier life, but it's because they're of little interest. They're just ignored.
Well, it's almost very dangerous because it's almost telling people, don't be good.
Yeah, you could see how you could take away from this. Oh, well, I don't want to be tested. I'll pass. I'll just go and be wicked then. Right? You could see how that could easily become a way of which one could read this. And I think that is dangerous, right? That someone would look in this and go, oh, I'll pass on the suffering, thanks. Okay, I think I'll pick up from the bottom, as I think we're out of readers, but we have a little bit more to go. So let's just have a look at where this goes. So again, they're exploring the same idea. He tests the righteous. What does this mean? As it is said, a tested stone. So an Isaiah reference about a stone that has been tested. Again, they're just bringing in all these verses to try and prove this idea. Similarly, he tests the righteous, strengthening him like this tested stone, which is a precious cornerstone. So too, he tests the righteous. This idea of the strongest materials are the ones that have been tested, the ones that have been actually in some way used and tried, and we know that they work. Those are the ones that are used for a cornerstone in a building, right? You're going to use a stone that is actually probably going to be deeply used already, scarred, pitted, whatever else, because you know it's strong. So similar idea in some way that God is putting the righteous through these tests because God knows they're strong, knows they can handle it, and it makes them even stronger because of it. We jump back to the wicked for a moment. But the wicked and one who loves violence, that's the original quote, sanea nafsho, right? His soul hates. What does sanea nafsho mean? Would you ever imagine that the soul of the Blessed Holy One hates that wicked one? Doesn't seem like we want to say that about God, right? Rather, that rung upon which all souls depend hates that soul of the wicked one, not wanting her at all, neither in this world nor in the world that is coming. So the wicked one and the one who loves violence, sanea nafsho, she hates his soul precisely. They try and play with this idea that actually it's not necessarily God who hates the soul of the wicked, but actually other souls, or the idea of soul abstractly, but it doesn't really work in my opinion, which is why they have an alternatively, sanea nafsho, his soul hates, as is said, Adonai Elohim has sworn by his soul, so he tests the righteous. And so they come back to the same place, that actually God, who we describe as having a soul, is actually swearing in some way by God's own soul to try and test the righteous. Now we get this little short history of some of the people that are involved, and that brings us up to where we are here, which is interesting. Just we're going to look at each of these, and then we'll try and wrap up and review. Come and see, when the Blessed Holy One created Adam, he commanded him for his own good and endowed him with wisdom, whose rungs he climbed. Descending below, he discovered the craving of the evil impulse and clung to it, forgetting all he had attained of the supernal glory of his Lord. So Adam fails the test. Then came Noah. At first is written, Noah was a completely righteous man. Later, he descended below and saw strong wine, unclarified, 1 day old. He drank some of it, became drunk, and exposed himself. So Noah failed the test. Then came Abraham. He ascended in wisdom, contemplating the glory of his Lord. Afterwards, there was a famine in the land, and Abraham went down to Egypt. Subsequently, what is written? Abraham went up from Egypt. Ascending to the rung he had attained at first. He entered at peace and emerged in peace. So the characterization of Abraham is that actually he started out being good, turned wicked, and then returned to being good. Abraham is the first one who does teshuvah, right? Who goes out in peace and returns to peace, who is able in some way to come back and return to being among the righteous. Then came Isaac. What is written? There was a famine in the land, and Isaac went. Isaac went and later ascended from there in peace. So Isaac never really struggles. Isaac is better than his father, who himself is better than Noah, who himself is better than Abraham, only just. It gets better and better and better. Every single one of the righteous is tested by the Blessed Holy One to elevate them in this world and in the world that is coming. So they don't really go on, but you could go on through all the other fascinating characters. Think about our righteous characters in the Torah. Moses, tested many times in many different ways. Aaron, tested many times. David, tested, fails, right? All of the characters that we associate with monarchy. Saul is tested. Solomon is tested. This theme actually is pretty consistent. This idea that it is precisely the righteous who have the biggest challenges, and not the wicked, who are kind of little interest to us, is pretty consistent with the Tanakh as a whole, right? That the characters that we dwell on are righteous, but they're complicated. They're not righteous because they never did anything bad. They're righteous because they had very difficult, challenging experiences, and they did all right. Some did better than others. Some didn't do very well at all. But mostly they responded to the test, to the challenge in front of them in the right way. And that's what ultimately makes them righteous, not something inherent about them. How do we feel about that? Welcome back, Jason.
It's frightening. I keep getting this thing in my mind where you've got like a source of power, almost like a magnet, and it's trying to collect back all these souls. It doesn't make any sense, but it's...
No, I can see it. It's somewhat menacing, isn't it, that image?
Yeah.
Yeah. There is a sense, right? There's a famous thing in the Kabbalah that's often talked about that basically the Zohar and other Kabbalah understands our souls as being a literal piece of God, right? So God is actually a thing which has been broken into pieces and dispersed among all living creatures, which I think is a really great theology, by the way, and one we don't talk about enough.
Because didn't it say something like that when God created at the beginning, when we had Genesis? In a sense, making man, and wasn't there something there?
Yeah, there's this imagery there of breathing, right? That God breathes into the being, and it has a soul. So in that sense, it's breath. But I think if we take the notion that all living things are themselves, the soul is not something. It's not like there's God and there's the soul. It's actually the soul is God. It's just physically distant from it, which actually is very close to your image, Janice, of a magnet, because the suggestion then is that these two things, the soul that's inside our bodies and inside all living things, and God, which is the collection of all those living things, want to be together, right? They're attracted to one another. They're drawn to one another. And it is a bit like a magnet, right? There's a force that kind of pulls the soul back, and it has a certain menacing gravitas to it.
But then, do you have this thing like reincarnation where the soul comes back again?
Yeah.
Is there anything in Judaism that says that?
100%, absolutely. The Kabbalah 100% believes in the idea of reincarnation. It's called Gilgul. It explores it in great detail, and it suggests that actually the pieces of the soul need to sometimes return to the world many times to be tested and to pass the test, to grow, to develop, to clarify, to elevate. And as a result, often these pieces of soul will come back in different forms in different ways, and each time kind of graduate from one level to the next. It's a very progressive idea of reincarnation, as opposed to the idea of reincarnation in the Vedic system, where you're kind of trapped in this wheel of rebirth that you can't stop and you want to get off of. The Kabbalistic sense of reincarnation is actually very much about what we just read, that each time the soul comes back, it's tested and purified and tried. It often uses the imagery of purifying gold, right? That when you're purifying a metal, you heat it up really, really hot, and then you can separate the pure gold from the dross, right? And that's what life is there to do. It's to purify the soul and allow it to separate. And that's what the tests, this idea of God testing the righteous, is really fit into.
That is quite a nice picture in itself. It's like a comforting picture in some ways.
Yeah. I think there is a comfort in this, that you can look at your life and the suffering in it and go, well, actually, that could be helping me. It's very hard to do when it's very acute and when you feel very afflicted by it. But there is something useful there about looking at suffering and seeing it as potentially useful, practical, even if you can't see the usefulness of it. Maybe in a reincarnation system, you can think, well, this is what I need to do this time. Maybe next time I'll do something else.
Yeah. Interesting.
I think it's what you're saying, but it's kind of hindsight's a wonderful thing.
Mm.
When you're going through those tests or whatever you want to call it, it's almost impossible to have that reflective ability. But after the event, you can go, yeah, I learned something from that, or
yeah,
something like that.
Yeah, and I think that's, those have to be two different things, right? How you relate to God while you're suffering, it has to be, and is usually different than after you've kind of passed through it. Just to link these back together, because they're two very different texts, but the idea of the national suffering, the people as a whole, and their suffering in exile, and the idea of individual righteous people who are tested by God, I actually think they kind of do come together in some way, right? That the people's story, the national story, the one we read about with the idea of the Shekhinah coming into exile with us and it being something that we had to endure and then ultimately to undertake to change by returning and rebuilding, there's a sense there where you can understand exile as a test as well, right? Of the people as a whole, whether they can pass that and elevate themselves in exile in order to return and be better, or whether actually they kind of struggle and fail and aren't able to summon the power and will to return and to rebuild. There's a sense where actually it seems like we can understand the course of Jewish history as this sense of God testing the righteous. It's a wonderfully troubling idea that God lets the wicked get away with stuff and postpones their punishment, but is really, really, really pedantic with the righteous and tests them and gives them trials and suffering. It's in some way a very Jewish idea, which helps us understand our difficult history, perhaps, as a people. But it also is a vision of God which isn't really about love and compassion and care as much as it is about helping people to grow and develop and change in as positive a way as possible. And I think, in both that we talked a little bit about parenting, and sometimes as a parent, right, your job is to be comforting and reassuring and to provide safety and security. And sometimes it's also to kind of, hopefully in a respectful and in a well-intentioned way, offer some trials, right, to children, to push them, to make them confront their own selves and grow out of it to be better than they were before. It's very hard to know how and when to do that. And I think it takes a lot of wisdom that I don't have, and many of us don't have. And again, to Jason, your point, in hindsight, we go, oops, did that wrong, often with parenting as well. But there's something comforting, perhaps, about this idea that God is trying to do the same. And maybe it doesn't always get it right, but both with individuals and with the people, it's trying to use the opportunity of exile, of suffering, of difficulty to make us better and to help us grow and ultimately to help us return, whether in another life or back to the land from which we came, and do so in a way that builds and rebuilds the kind of world we want. So there's interesting corollaries, and neither is something that you encounter too often in mainstream Jewish texts. So it's useful to see it in the Zohar, where it's actually quite well fleshed out. Thanks for joining me. And lovely to see you guys. And hope you have a good evening. And hope dinner is delicious. And see you soon. We have a little bit of a break, I think, before we're back. Check the diary and update us in our group, but I think we got a little bit, couple weeks.
And we're on Thursday, aren't we?
Yep, university is back on Thursday.
And that's it for November then, until December.
That's right.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.